I think
Perfect.
no, that should be it. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me and that I can be here. When I was invited and when I was thinking about the theme of today's meeting, I thought it might be a good idea to compare contrasting strategies of human societies in the same environmental setting and the different outcomes these different approaches may have had. And I'm using two time periods which I'm familiar with, the Chalcolithic period on the one hand and the Late Bronze Age on the other. And I will focus on the geography, which those of you who are in Ankara today will see when looking out of the window, the geography of North Central Anatolia. And I will start by explaining why this landscape can be described as challenging, and using evidence from the Budaköy Valley, that is where Boğazköy is. As case studies, we will have a look at how people dealt with these challenges in different times, and I will then conclude with a few general points suggested by these case studies. Oh, okay, this works. So it's quite common to begin talks like this with these kind of environmental questions, with some snarky remarks maybe about environmental determinism. I must admit that I'm personally not having such a big problem with this concept. I'm actually quite happy with the idea that the environment imposes limitations to human agency. And the quote, the slightly depressing quote, which you see here on the screen, is from Fernand Braudel, the godfather of the Annales school. And Braudel, of course, was a bit extreme in this respect. And according to his gloomy outlook, the wheels of the long term are rumbling on without mercy, and nothing we human ants can do will have any influence on these processes. And the passiveness of Braudel's humans has often and quite justifiably been criticized. In reality, humans do have wiggle room to follow different strategies within their environmental setting, but our actions have consequences, and often we may not like the bill when it is eventually presented. Why do I say that the North Central Anatolian environment was challenging? Mostly, this geography is characterized by narrow plains framed by long mountain chains, and typically these plains do not discharge the runoff water very well and are still quite marshy in places. And there's an absence of open plains and large water bodies with open shorelines, which are more typical in other Anatolian regions. Today, this landscape is largely devoid of higher vegetation or covered by shrubs. And it has been known for quite some time that this is an anthropogenic condition and that this area should naturally be covered by forests. Direct environmental data are not plentiful, but two pollen cores from further to the west appear to indicate first human disturbance not before the 4th millennium BC, and there are some other evidence pointing in a similar direction. The present almost completely denuded state is relatively recent. Famously, for example, Timur was able to hide his war elephants in the forest before the Battle of Ankara in 1402. And in the 19th century, charcoal making was still practiced around Boğazköy, which would not be a very profitable profession today. And this area is set apart from other Anatolian regions by an absence of Neolithic occupation. And the reasons for this have been controversially discussed in the past, and research bias has often been cited. However, the fact remains that the Neolithic mound settlements, which we know from elsewhere, are missing here, and that the open areas they preferred were simply not existent in this landscape. The earliest known site is a small settlement on Büyükkaya, dating to the mid-6th millennium BC. So when quite a while ago I wrote my PhD on the chronology of this area that didn't have anything to do with the environment at this point, I noticed when reviewing all these places something strange about most of the early sites in this area. They tend to be unusually small and located always at elevated locations well above the valley bottoms. And on this image here, you can see some typical examples of these sites where these arrows are, but I could have presented here many more from areas further away from Boğazköy away. And apart from their small size and peculiar location, none of these sites has much evidence for weapons or heavy tools. So, and based on this in my head, I thought that at some point, maybe in the early 6th millennium, pioneer farmers penetrated this area from the fringes, and in the absence of open spaces, they would have established themselves above the swampy valley bottoms, opening small and rather isolated islands in the forest through slash and burn agriculture. And as the restriction of space would have only allowed a small number of animals, such an economy would probably have to be based on secondary products, especially dairy products. I also thought that most activities of such communities would have focused on surviving in an environment that was so challenging that sane prehistoric people did not bother going here. So a few years later, the German Archaeological Institute offered me the chance to investigate such a site in detail. That is Çamlıbel-Tarlası, which is a typical site with these characteristics. That was the reason why we chose it in the first place. And you will not be very surprised to hear that things turned out a little bit differently than expected. That always happens in cases like this. So the site is tucked away. Well, maybe I shouldn't have moved on. The site is tucked away in a lateral branch of the main Budaköse Valley, which you see here in the distance. It sits on a plateau above a small stream coming down from higher up in the valley, and there isn't very much room for more than a few houses there. And the first surprise here was that despite its insubstantial appearance, Çamlıbel-Tarlası had 3 architectural phases which were separated by periods of abandonment. And during these 4 non-architectural or non-residential phases, the site was still visited, probably on a seasonal basis over the summer months. There's a whole range of agricultural and pyrotechnical activities going on at this time, and people also used the ruins for the burial of children. So the children were buried in the abandoned settlement. And across the valley, not very far away, there is a similar and apparently contemporary site of the site of Yarıkaya, excavated much earlier in the 1960s and not fully published, which shows a similar on-off pattern. And I think these are the same people actually who lived there. So this is not a neighboring settlement, that's the same settlement we are talking about. All of this happened in a restricted span of only about 150 years, probably even shorter than that, in the mid-4th millennium. And because of a plateau in the calibration curve, it's difficult to model the duration of the individual phases. But if we would mechanically attribute all phases the same length of time, we would arrive at no more than 25 years per phase. In reality, the residential phases were probably shorter and the non-residential phases longer than that, which is a very strange settlement pattern compared to what we know from other places in this time period. And the microfauna points to a forested swampy setting, and charcoal analysis suggests that the surrounding forest cover consisted mainly of oak. Yeah, so the site was sitting in the forest, but not conifer forest, but oak forest. And that's actually the forest which comes back if you protect an area here in this area and wait what happens. That's what comes back. That's oak forest which grows at first. The houses themselves had a roughly uniform size and typically consist of a main part with a large oven and an attached storage unit. So you see these storage units here on these houses. And note that 90-degree angles seem to be optional, which is sort of indicative of the approach to everything these guys did at this time. Many of the floors, inside and outside, consisted of lime, which is already a bit of a strange feature here. The archaeobotanical data shows that agriculture was based on intensive cultivation on long-established fields. So out of the window goes the slash and burn agriculture. And it seems also to indicate that the fields continued to be used even when the settlement itself had moved elsewhere, which then means that it wasn't really very far away. In the animal bone spectrum, there are indications of secondary product exploitation, especially for cattle. You see the survival, the age of the cattle here. However, the most striking feature is the prominence of pigs. And at first glance, this appears to make a lot of sense in a forested environment where you can just send the pigs out and they find their own food. However, stable isotope analysis on human bone shows that animal protein intake was not very significant at that time. And that already doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. And indeed, statistical modeling of all available isotopic data indicates that the main staple for human subsistence was not the grain and not the animals, but pulses. About a third of the pottery spectrum, and don't be afraid, I'm not going into that very much here, of all the vessels taken together, more than a third consisted of drinking vessels, and some of which had been quite elaborately decorated, and that was a bit of a surprise. And to make a complex argument short, it seems that, and what were the drinking? In all likelihood, that must have been some sort of beer, I think. So to make this argument short, because I could speak an hour about that topic alone, it seems that pig consumption and at least part of the grain harvest were used in feasting context rather than in day-to-day subsistence. And there is also some direct evidence for feasting at the site. The presence of humans in this valley seems to have resulted in considerable damage and erosion around the site. So when Ben Marsh, that was our geomorphologist, when he came and studied the surroundings, he was all excited because even in this generally very damaged north central Anatolian landscape, this was a beauty. And the reason for that, I mean, obviously there is a long history of damaging behavior in this area, but as far as our Chalcolithic people are concerned, this damage was probably caused by chopping down trees for the pyrotechnical efforts practiced at this place here, which people engaged in during and in between the residential phases. And there's little evidence that the output of these efforts was relevant for the survival of this community. So they did a lot of stuff which often required temperatures above 1000 centigrades, which isn't so straightforward to reach into this range, to do all things they actually didn't really need. And the suspicion is that after 150 years of this behavior, the valley surrounding Chamlebel Talasse was not an attractive location anymore, and that people moved on to mess with a similar location nearby. In summary, it seems that Chamlebel Talasse is representative for a settlement mode in which single very small communities, so this is even below a proper village size, that is only a handful of people, these were cycling through a number of favorable locations within the same valley complex. And the distances were probably not very large, as some resources were continuously used. And when you bury your children at such an abandoned site, this is also quite likely that this is not extremely far away. And during this time, they engaged in a wide range of environmentally wasteful practices whose main purpose seems to have been the social sphere. And this is not a reflection of a society which lived under very stressful adaptive conditions. Instead, low local and overall population numbers and the short-lived nature of the individual settlement sites appear to have prevented a destructive impact on the ecosystem as a whole. And we could say that this system was wasteful and a bit annoying maybe from the perspective of the forest, but overall stable within the given parameters. So, I mean, here you have the pigs and the beer. So I think that illustrates the point quite nicely. Roughly 2,000 years later, the landscape had changed, and North Central Anatolia was now home to an urban civilization with a complex settlement system on multiple tiers, which was based by definition on a much increased mobilization of resources. Yeah, you need these resources to feed the non-agricultural productive parts of the population. It is clear that there has been some clearance of forest at this stage, which is also reflected in the animal bone spectra, and limited pollen evidence shows, however, that mixed deciduous and conifer forestation was still quite widespread at this time. And throughout their history, the Hittites remained suspicious of the undeveloped countryside and regarded the space as dangerous and as a liminal zone. And while initially, when we think about the Middle Bronze Age and the beginning of the Hittite period, while initially political and administrative control of the rural sector was a matter for the local power holders at that time, increasingly during the course of Hittite history, centralization is a general tendency throughout the second millennium. And like other late Bronze Age powers, the Hittite Empire suffered from a shortage of population and invested much effort to increase population numbers. And part of this effort was the foundation of new settlements, which played the role of regional centers. And Kushak-Larissa is a famous example of such a newly founded settlement. The development of previously uncleared land was actively encouraged, and the injection of population into undeveloped forested land, also on the village and hamlet level, was not always voluntary. There is evidence of a concept which seems weird from a modern perspective: large-scale forced immigration. And at all of these development attempts were successful, smaller settlements often disappeared, and whole regions appear occasionally to have lost their inhabitants. This is already an indication of a dangerous characteristic of the North Central Anatolian mountain zone, the irregular occurrence of catastrophic harvest failures on regional level, which is caused by microclimatic fluctuations within this highly fragmented landscape. And as Jürgen Seher and Andreas Schachner have shown, this continues to be a problem in this area throughout history up to present times. We can safely assume that by the mid-second millennium, when these efforts of population boost kicked off in earnest, there did not really exist any incidentally empty spaces in this landscape anymore. So systematic clearance may have somewhat increased the agricultural potential, but it is clear that an artificial increase of population required a mechanism to deal with the ever-present danger of local failure. And the Hittite solution was to create a state-sponsored buffer mechanism, large granaries situated in the urban centers in which huge volumes of grain were stored long-term and under hermetic conditions. And as Jürgen Seher has shown, these granaries had to be filled and emptied in one go and were too big to be meant to be for the urban population alone. In all likelihood, they were opened in the event of regional harvest failures. And all regional centers seem to have had such installations. Their exaggerated numbers in the capital might suggest that Hattusha functioned as a second line defense or as the buffer's buffer. And recent research on the only intact granary in Boğazköy suggests that their content was grown specifically for this purpose under extensive low input agricultural conditions, and that each chamber of these chambers building here was filled with grain from one specific location. And this indicates a very systematic, planned and tightly administered approach. And overall, this looks like a very effective, if somewhat top-down solution. There's also a second line of argument that this mechanism was indeed a core element of late Bronze Age settlement in North Central Anatolia, As we all know, the area was rather badly affected by the crisis at the turn from the 13th to the 12th century. Most areas of the Eastern Mediterranean experienced problems at this point, so the Hittites were not alone in this respect. However, I think that it is not always recognized enough that nowhere else the collapse of the state had as catastrophic consequences as in north-central Anatolia. What we see here is that within a few decades, even or maybe even less, a nearly complete, so this happened by itself. Why did that happen? So a nearly complete depopulation of the whole region took place. And the recent discovery of a few cells of squatters hanging on in the urban ruins in Boaske and elsewhere does not change this picture. And this is definitely not normal. So when society collapses elsewhere, usually this leads to a reduced social complexity, and this is not a very pleasant experience, but not to whole populations disappearing entirely. And in my mind, this can only be explained by the occurrence of some sort of cumulative destructive runaway effect, which happened so quickly that there was no time for adaptive adjustment. And the sudden loss of a state-sponsored buffer mechanism in combination with maybe more than normal local failures could have triggered such a situation, which then snowballed into catastrophe. And it is surely no coincidence that the tribally organized people in the Hittite periphery appear not affected by this development. So did the Hittite villages follow any wasteful practices which may have made the situation worse? In the absence of any archaeological investigation of Hittite village sites, this is impossible to answer, but nothing points into such a direction. Was the system sustainable? I think it was sustainable as long as it worked. And in the Hittite case, that was several centuries, which is not bad. The real problem is that its complexity made it not very resilient. It was fragile and prone to catastrophic failure. And what is then the lesson which we can take away from this comparison of our two different models of living in the same landscape? Both examples show that a challenging environment does not necessarily have to be a hostile environment. Indeed, whether or not an environment has to be labeled challenging appears to be largely dependent on our behavior within it. And Chamlebel Thalassa suggests maybe a little bit counterintuitively that wastefulness by itself is not always a problem either. The most important stabilizing factor in our case appears to have flexibility in spatial movement in combination with low population numbers. Risk and the danger of environmental punishment increases with growing economic complexity, and the countermeasures taken by the Hittites worked well, but added to the fragility of their existence in this landscape. And overall, my impression is that centralization was the Hittites' undoing in the end. The Hittites of the first half of the second millennium would probably have survived the late Bronze Age crisis with a black eye. A society living the Chamlebel Thalassa way, I'm sure, wouldn't even have noticed that there was a crisis happen. And I had to do that in the end, and you have to forgive me about that. If this would have been a competition, then the score would certainly have gone to the prehistoric Chamlebel people. Thank you very much.